Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about how I, Winston Churchill, learned to keep getting up after being knocked flat by life. I'm not here to give you a polished, heroic version of my journey. You'll get the real thing, stumbles and all. My hope is that my misadventures might help you spot the hidden value in your own failures. So before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to my channel to support me making more great videos. And since you're watching from your own corner of the world, whether it's morning in Melbourne, afternoon in New York, or midnight in Mumbai, thank you for joining me. Now, let's listen to my compelling story in this video. I didn't arrive in politics as a cautious diplomat. Oh no, I charged in like a bull in a china shop, convinced that my talent and boldness would carry me to the top. My early life was a curious mix of privilege and insecurity. Born into an aristocratic family, yes, but my father barely noticed me, and my schoolmasters often despaired of my academic performance. I scraped through my studies and found a calling in the military, which at least gave me adventure and a sense of purpose. But it was politics I truly wanted. In 1900, I won a seat in Parliament, already dreaming of becoming Prime Minister one day. And here's the thing. When you start with that kind of confidence, the universe likes to arrange a few reality checks to keep you humble. My first big lesson came in 1904 when I switched political parties. You'd think a man could change his mind and still be liked, right? Wrong. Half my colleagues saw me as a traitor, and the other half weren't sure they could trust me either. I learned that political loyalty is a fragile thing, and my reputation took a beating. Then came the Dardanelles disaster in World War I. As First Lord of the Admiralty, I was partly responsible for a campaign that turned into a bloody failure. Thousands of soldiers died, and my name was dragged through the mud in newspapers across Britain. The public didn't just criticize me, they wanted me gone. I resigned, humiliated and out of favor, wondering if I just ended my political career at the age of 40. If you've ever been so embarrassed that you wished you could erase your own name from the record, you'll understand how I felt. One day, I was in the cabinet directing naval strategy. The next, I was standing in the cold, shut out of the halls of power. People crossed the street to avoid speaking to me. My mail was full of insults. And the worst part? I knew I'd made mistakes. It wasn't all unfair. But here's the strange thing about failure. It has a way of stripping you down to the essentials. I started to realize that I couldn't rebuild my life using the same self-assured arrogance that had gotten me into trouble. I needed patience, humility, and a willingness to listen. Not easy qualities for a man like me, but essential if I wanted a second chance. I retreated to the military again, this time as an infantry officer in the trenches of the Western Front. Yes, you heard that right. I went from the Admiralty's wood-paneled offices to sleeping in muddy dugouts, eating cold rations, and dodging German shells. Some people thought I was mad to volunteer for frontline duty, but for me, it was a way to prove that I wasn't just a desk soldier. I wanted to earn back respect the hard way. In the mud and smoke of France, I learned something I'd never have picked up in Parliament. That leadership isn't about always being right. It's about standing by people in their worst moments. I shared the same dangers as my men. I saw fear in their eyes and recognized it in my own. And somehow, those months in uniform gave me the grit I'd need for the battles ahead. Not just military battles, but political ones too. When I finally returned to civilian life, I still faced ridicule. My name was a punchline at political dinners. Cartoonists loved to draw me as a stubborn bulldog gnawing on impossible ideas. But slowly, I began to understand that stubbornness could be a strength if I could aim it at the right goals and temper it with wisdom. Looking back now, those early stumbles were the foundation of everything I later achieved. Without the Dardanelles disaster, I might never have learned to swallow my pride and keep moving forward. Without being out of office, I might never have discovered how much I actually loved the fight to get back in. And here's the takeaway for you. Failure isn't a verdict. It's a training ground. My early political missteps didn't destroy me. They trained me for the storm that was coming. I didn't know it at the time, but those humiliations were sharpening the tools I'd need to face a war that would threaten the survival of my entire country. In the next part of my story, I'll tell you about what I call my wilderness years, a long stretch when I was out of power, out of favor, and left talking mostly to myself. But during that time, I discovered the art of waiting for the right moment and the importance of never letting the world's indifference convince you to disappear. In reality, they were anything but. Imagine being locked out of the only club you ever wanted to belong to, standing in the rain, watching through the window while everyone else clinks glasses and makes deals inside. That was my life from 1929 to 1939, 10 long years without an official post, without influence, and without much public affection either. I wasn't completely alone, of course. I still had my family, my circle of close friends, and my writing. But politically, I was treated like an eccentric relic. People would say, "Oh, Winston, yes, he's good for a stirring speech, but he's out of touch with modern politics." It was the polite version of, "Ignore him." The trouble was, I couldn't just fade into the background. It's not in my nature to quietly sip tea and stop caring about national affairs. Britain was changing, Europe was growing tense, and I could smell danger in the air. Hitler had risen to power in Germany, and while many leaders thought they could negotiate with him, I believed otherwise. I spoke up, loudly and often, warning that appeasement was a dangerous path. You might think people would appreciate that kind of foresight, but no. My speeches in Parliament about rearming Britain and preparing for war were met with rolled eyes and bored sighs. Newspapers painted me as a warmonger, a relic of the Victorian age who just wanted another grand war to relive his youth. It was frustrating beyond belief. When you know you're right but no one will listen, every day feels like you're screaming into a hurricane. So, I turned to writing and history. If they wouldn't give me a seat at the table, I'd build my own desk. I wrote books about my ancestors, about the Great War, about the state of the empire. Writing kept my mind sharp and my arguments polished. I knew that if the time ever came when my warnings were proven true, I had to be ready to speak clearly and persuasively, not with bitterness, but with conviction. Here's the tricky part about the wilderness. It tempts you to grow bitter. And bitterness is a trap. It feels satisfying in the moment, but it eats you alive from the inside. I made a conscious decision to channel my frustration into preparation. I studied Germany's military expansion, I followed every political shift in Europe, and I strengthened my public speaking even further. And yet, those years weren't just about hard work. They were also about learning patience. That might surprise you, because patience and I were not natural friends. I wanted to act, not wait. But politics, like life, has its seasons. Sometimes the only move is to stay ready until the weather changes. I also learned the value of keeping your allies close and your critics within arm's reach. Even the people who mocked me could sometimes provide useful information or support when circumstances shifted. Burning bridges in politics is like tossing away a lifeboat. You never know when you might need it. Financially, the wilderness years were no picnic either. My writing helped, but it wasn't always enough to cover the lifestyle I'd built. There were times when bills piled up, and I had to take on speaking engagements or newspaper articles just to keep things afloat. Humbling, yes, but also grounding. It reminded me that no one, not even a former cabinet minister, is immune to the realities of life. And then, in the late 1930s, the world began to turn. Germany's aggression grew bolder. Austria, Czechoslovakia, and the fantasy of peace in our time began to crumble. Suddenly, the same people who had dismissed my warnings were looking at me with new eyes. I wasn't a warmonger anymore. I was the man who had been right all along. This is why the wilderness years matter. When the call finally came in 1939 to return to the Admiralty, I didn't have to scramble to get ready. I was ready. I had kept my mind sharp, my speeches polished, and my understanding of the threat crystal clear. If I'd spent those 10 years sulking in the corner, I'd have missed my chance to step back into the fight when my country needed me most. And here's the lesson for you. The quiet seasons of life aren't wasted unless you waste them. Just because you're not in the spotlight doesn't mean you're not building the skills, the resilience, and the insight you'll need for your next big moment. When I finally walked back into government, it wasn't as the same man who had left in disgrace years before. I was more disciplined, more strategic, and yes, more patient. The wilderness had taught me that survival isn't just about fighting. Sometimes it's about enduring until the right opportunity comes along. In the next part, I'll tell you about that opportunity, how I went from the shadows to the front line again, and how the comeback was both thrilling and terrifying. Because when the door swings open, you have to be ready to nine. It wasn't exactly a gentle invitation. It was a jolt, the kind of moment that makes your heart thump in your chest. Britain had declared war on Germany, and I was summoned back as First Lord of the Admiralty, the same position I had held during the Dardanelles disaster. You can imagine what was going through my mind. Here we go again. Don't mess it up this time, Winston. I walked into the Admiralty with mixed emotions. Pride to be back in service, but also the heavy weight of knowing that failure here would not just be personal, it would be national. This time, I had no illusions. War was not the place for grand gestures without careful planning. I made it my business to listen, to consult, and to be decisive without being reckless. Those early months were filled with sleepless nights, poring over maps, scanning reports, and sending telegrams to commanders at sea. I knew the Navy had to be aggressive, but also adaptable. My years in the wilderness had taught me the value of preparation, so I kept my staff working round the clock on intelligence gathering and strategic flexibility. Then, in May 1940, the storm truly broke. Germany's blitzkrieg tore through Western Europe, and France was collapsing. The British government was in chaos. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain had lost the confidence of Parliament, and suddenly my name was on everyone's lips as his likely replacement. It's one thing to imagine yourself as Prime Minister while sitting in the backbenches. It's another to face it when your nation is on the brink of annihilation. I didn't leap at the job with unbridled joy. I understood too well the magnitude of what I was stepping into. Britain stood virtually alone against Hitler, and the fate of the free world, no exaggeration, hung in the balance. My own party was split, and many doubted I could unite the country. Still, when the king asked me to form a government, I accepted, because the alternative was unthinkable. The first weeks as prime minister were a blur of crisis meetings and impossible decisions. Our troops were trapped at Dunkirk, and I had to authorize Operation Dynamo, the desperate evacuation of over 300,000 soldiers. It was a gamble, relying on naval ships and civilian vessels alike to cross the channel under constant attack from the Luftwaffe. Against all odds, it worked. The miracle of Dunkirk became a rallying point for Britain, but I knew the war was far from over. Every day brought new challenges. The Battle of Britain loomed, and our pilots faced overwhelming odds. I visited airfields, shook hands with mechanics, stood among the debris of bombed neighborhoods. I needed the people to see that I was with them, not locked away in a safe bunker, but in the thick of their struggle. This is where my comeback truly crystallized. All those years of being ignored, dismissed, and underestimated had forged in me a stubborn confidence. I refused to entertain defeatism. In my speeches, I didn't promise an easy victory. I promised struggle, endurance, and, ultimately, triumph. When I said, "We shall never surrender," it wasn't just rhetoric. It was the distilled essence of every battle I'd fought in my personal life. Still, it wasn't easy. The pressure was relentless. At times, I doubted myself. Late at night, in the quiet moments between telegrams and phone calls, I'd wonder whether the weight was too much, whether someone else could do better. But then I'd think back to the Dardanelles, to the wilderness years, to every time I'd been told I was finished, and I'd remember that resilience is not a burst of bravery, but the daily choice to stand your ground. One of the hardest lessons in leadership is knowing when to be flexible and when to be immovable. In war, you must adapt your tactics constantly, but your core principles, courage, determination, and the will to fight must never waver. My earlier failures had taught me the danger of arrogance, so I made sure to surround myself with capable advisors, even those who disagreed with me. Dissent, I'd learned, was not the enemy. Complacency was. By the end of 1940, Britain had survived the Blitz. Our cities were battered, our people weary, but our spirit unbroken. My comeback wasn't about reclaiming personal glory. It was about using every scrap of experience, every scar from past defeats, to keep the nation standing when it could have easily collapsed. Looking back, I realized that this period wasn't just a political return. It was a personal redemption. I had come full circle from my early blunders, and I could see how each mistake had prepared me for these moments. Without the pain of the Dardanelles, I might not have had the humility to listen. Without the wilderness years, I might not have had the patience to wait for the right time. And without the constant failures in between, I might not have had the sheer stubbornness to hold the line when all seemed lost. In the next part of my story, I'll take you into the heart of the war years, where the pressures grew even greater and the stakes even higher. Because surviving the opening act of a crisis is one thing, leading through its darkest nights, portraits of the great leader, speeches that echo through the ages, moments of triumph framed in black and white photographs. But let me tell you, from the inside, it's far less glamorous. It's endless paperwork, impossible decisions, and the constant knowledge that every choice you make could send thousands to their deaths or save them. By 1941, the war had settled into a long, grinding ordeal. The Luftwaffe's relentless bombing had failed to break our spirit, but Britain was exhausted. Supplies were tight, our navy was stretched thin, and our army still recovering from Dunkirk's losses. My job was not only to direct military strategy, but also to keep the morale of the entire country from collapsing. Some days that meant giving fiery speeches. Other days it meant quietly visiting bombed-out neighborhoods, listening to ordinary people who had lost everything, yet still offered me a cup of tea. Those moments reminded me why we were fighting. This wasn't about politics or prestige. It was about the right of every man, woman, and child to live free from tyranny. The hardest part, though, was the loneliness of leadership. People imagine a war cabinet as a hive of bustling conversation, but the truth is that the final responsibility sits with one person. I could consult my generals, argue with ministers, and read mountains of reports. But when the time came to act, whether to launch an attack, divert resources, or reject a peace offer, the decision was mine. And with each one, I felt the weight of history pressing down. There were moments when surrender seemed like the easy way out. Let me be honest. Yes, the thought crossed my mind. When France fell and the U-boats were sinking our ships faster than we could replace them, there were influential voices in Britain urging negotiation with Hitler. But I had learned from my own life that retreat in the face of difficulty often leads to far greater disaster later. So I rejected compromise. We would fight on, no matter the cost. This was where my stubborn streak, which had caused so much trouble earlier in my career, became my greatest asset. I refused to accept that Britain was finished. I refused to let fear dictate our strategy. I refused to give Hitler even the smallest psychological victory. The United States' entry into the war in late 1941 brought hope, but also new challenges. Suddenly, I had to manage a delicate alliance with President Franklin Roosevelt and, later, with Joseph Stalin. It was a political balancing act worthy of a circus performer. One false move, and the whole coalition could have unraveled. I had to be firm with our allies while never losing sight of the fact that their commitment was essential to victory. It was during this time that I leaned heavily on one lesson from my early failures: the importance of surrounding yourself with people who will tell you the truth. I kept ministers and generals in my inner circle who were unafraid to challenge me. Disagreement might slow a meeting, but it also prevented us from charging headlong into another Dardanelles-style disaster. And let's not forget, war isn't just fought on the battlefield, it's fought in the hearts and minds of people. My speeches became weapons in themselves. I didn't write to inspire empty optimism. I wrote to prepare people for the long haul. Blood, toil, tears, and sweat wasn't a slogan. It was a promise. And the people respected that honesty. Yet the war years took their toll. Sleep was a luxury, meals were often hurried, and the constant strain wore down even my famously thick skin. I had days when I snapped at colleagues, nights when I stared at maps until dawn, wondering if I had made the right call. Failure in war doesn't just mean bad headlines, it means dead soldiers, grieving families, and shattered cities. That knowledge never left me. Still, there were victories that reminded me why we endured. The turning of the tide in North Africa, the success of the Battle of the Atlantic, and later the D-Day landings, all were the result of persistence, planning, and an unshakable refusal to yield. I could feel the momentum shifting, though the cost in lives was staggering. When victory in Europe finally came in May 1945, I should have felt pure elation. And yes, there was joy, relief, and pride. But there was also exhaustion and the haunting memory of those who didn't live to see it. My own triumph was inseparable from the sacrifices of millions. And yet, just weeks after leading Britain through its darkest hours, I faced a stunning personal blow. My party lost the general election. One moment, I was the celebrated wartime leader. The next, I was packing up my office and heading back into political exile. It was a harsh reminder that no matter how high you climb, life has a way of knocking you back down. In the final part of my story, I'll share how I faced that loss, not as a defeat, but as another chance to rise again. Because resilience isn't about one grand victory. It's about getting up every single time you're knocked over, stepping from the blinding light of a stage into an empty, dark theater. One day, I was receiving the cheers of grateful crowds. The next, I was watching Clement Attlee walk into 10 Downing Street as the new prime minister. The people I had led through war had voted me out. Graciously, yes, but decisively. At first, it stung more than I expected. I had given everything, my voice, my health, my peace of mind, to keep Britain free. And yet, when peace came, the nation wanted something different. I understood it, even if it bruised my pride. After 6 years of war, people wanted social reform, housing, jobs, and new beginnings. They didn't want more speeches about struggle. They wanted a quiet cup of tea in a home with an intact roof. I could have retired then, closed my notebook, and lived out my days painting, writing, and enjoying Chartwell with my family. But as you might have guessed by now, stepping aside entirely was not in my nature. I still had work to do, and I still had things to say. So I returned to what had sustained me in the wilderness years: writing, reflection, and watching the world with a careful eye. My post-war speeches were not about rousing Britain to fight, but about warning of new dangers, especially the rise of Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. In 1946, I delivered my Iron Curtain speech in the United States, and suddenly I was back in the headlines. Some thought I was stirring trouble again. Others realized I was sounding an early alarm about the Cold War that was already beginning. Those years after losing power taught me one of the hardest lessons in resilience. Sometimes you have to redefine what victory means. I was no longer shaping events from the driver's seat, but I could still influence the course by speaking, advising, and writing. And influence, though less visible than command, can be just as powerful. Of course, politics has a way of circling back. In 1951, 6 years after my final defeat, I was re-elected as prime minister. But by then I was a different man, older, slower, more aware of my limits. My second term was less about grand battles and more about steadying Britain in a turbulent post-war world. I focused on foreign policy, nuclear issues, and maintaining Britain's role on the global stage, even as the empire slowly faded. Eventually, age caught up with me, and in 1955, I stepped down for good. But here's the truth. I never stopped getting up in one form or another. Whether it was after the Dardanelles, the wilderness years, the crises of war, or an election loss, I refused to treat any setback as the end of the story. And that, I think, is the heart of what I've learned about resilience. It's not about pretending you're invincible or charging ahead without fear. It's about understanding that life will knock you flat, sometimes hard, sometimes more than once, and deciding that you will stand up again, dust yourself off, and get back in the fight, even if the fight looks different each time. If you've stayed with me through this journey, you've seen how my life was a chain of rises and falls, victories and humiliations, cheers and boos. From those cycles, I came to believe that no defeat is final unless you accept it as such. So wherever you are, whatever challenge you face, remember this: your story isn't over when you lose. It's over when you stop trying to write the next chapter. Summary and conclusion, 300 words. My journey, from a brash young officer turned politician, through humiliating blunders, long years in the political wilderness, wartime leadership, and the sting of post-war defeat, has been a testament to the art of getting up after failure. I learned early that success is never a straight climb. It's a winding path with valleys as deep as the peaks are high. The Dardanelles disaster taught me humility. The wilderness years taught me patience. My return to the Admiralty and rise to Prime Minister taught me readiness, that when opportunity knocks, you must already have your boots on. The war years tested my resolve daily, proving that leadership means standing firm even when the odds are brutal. And losing the 1945 election taught me to reinvent myself, to find purpose, even when stripped of official power. At each stage, the temptation to give up was real. But I discovered that resilience is a choice made over and over, not a single act of courage, but a daily commitment to move forward. I surrounded myself with people who challenged me. I adapted without losing my core convictions, and I kept my mind sharp in the quiet seasons so I'd be ready for the storm. So if my life offers any lesson worth keeping, it's this: defeat is never the end unless you decide it is. Stand up again, even if you've been knocked down a dozen times. Your future victories may depend on the wisdom you gain from today's setbacks.